Hello, and welcome to the panel on incarceration and the courts. I'm Craig Dellimore from WBBM Newsradio, and I'm going to sort of act as the moderator for this discussion. But just to open things up, putting people behind bars by most measures should not be a simple decision. The effects are so far-reaching for the inmate, for the people left behind, for the correction system, and of course, for the economy. But Illinois has a lot of people behind bars. Figures from the Illinois Department of Corrections peg the prison population at just over 38,000 at the end of last year, but that's more than 20% below the peak population of 49,400 back in February of 2013. And the Civic Federation says the department spends about $1.5 billion a year. And remember, that's just the state prison population. The counties are issues unto themselves, all 102 of them. They each have a sheriff, state's attorneys, and judges, all making decisions about who does or doesn't remain in custody and how they travel through our justice system, or is it really dozens of systems? So our aim here is to talk about the broad effects of incarceration and the ways in which people are put in jails or prison. We want to talk about how equitable or not the process can be. Who makes the decisions on diverting people to alternatives and how? There are major efforts to reduce jail and prison populations, but with so many people being shot every week in Chicago, for example, there's some pushback from the general public, among others. So how do we balance justice with public safety? Then there's public health. We have to talk about COVID-19. Throughout Illinois, prison procedures radically changed as a result of the pandemic. All Department of Corrections facilities were closed to visitors. Facilities were with confirmed cases went on lockdown, and transfers between prisons were halted. So the courts have had to rule on how Illinois' prisons fail to protect inmates from COVID-19. We want to consider how best to move forward with reforms. So that's a pretty tall order for an hour-long discussion, but we have a panel used to dealing with the biggest issues and crises of one kind or another. And it consists of the Chief Justice of the Illinois Supreme Court, Ann Burke, Cook County Board President Toni Preckwinkle, Jobi Case, the head of Restored Justice, and Sharone Mitchell of the Illinois Justice Project, one of our hosts here today. So we're going to call on the Chief Justice first. Chief Justice Ann Burke was a special counsel to Governor Edgar for Child Welfare Services and was appointed to the appellate court in 1995, elected to a full term next year, and she has risen to lead the Supreme Court now. And good morning, Chief Justice. It's good to see you again, and please, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Craig. First of all, I'd like to thank the Illinois Justice Project, all the co-conveners, and the panel members for all the panels today and their participation, but especially for their service to our community and to help other people. I'd like to begin by saying hello to everyone, and I'd like to talk about prior to the pandemic. We in the judicial branch were already pursuing many reforms relating to incarceration, and particularly pre-trial incarceration. And to give one example, I would like to say that President Toni Preckwinkle, the Cook County Justice Advisory Council, and justice stakeholders in Cook County embarked on a pre-trial bond court initiative to collaborate on bond reform. One of the pressing concerns was the incarceration of individuals prior to trial just because they could not afford bail. At first, it was very difficult to garner support from the stakeholders. However, with persistence, eventually, over the course of several years, the stakeholders were successful in creating a fairer model to determine who should be detained prior to trial and who should not. To me, the critical lesson to be drawn from this experience is that collaboration among stakeholders is the key to achieving any successful reform. Now, deep in the pandemic, this lesson has truly been brought to home. People often forget, as Craig had mentioned, how large and how diverse the Illinois court system is. There are 24 circuits in our state. Only 6 of these circuits, including Cook County Circuit, are within the confines of a single county. The remaining circuit courts contain between 2 and 12 counties each. What this means is that any attempt to address issues such as incarceration rates, the health and safety of detainees, will involve the local authorities, multiple county sheriffs, multiple county health departments, and multiple county boards. Collaboration is the only path forward. Now, if there was ever a silver lining to this pandemic for the judicial branch, it may be that it has forced greater interaction and collaboration among all our stakeholders on a statewide basis, which has been a very good consequence. To give just a few examples of this that have occurred over the past 4 months, in early March, the Supreme Court began holding COVID-19 court leadership calls with judges, clerks, and key staff from around the state, the appellate courts and circuit courts throughout the state. First calls were via teleconference, then we moved to Zoom in April. During these calls, all the judges and staff and stakeholders shared their experiences and shared what they were doing about things such as remote bond hearings via Zoom, holding court calls in local schools, auditoriums, because the court system or the court place of justice, the courthouse, wasn't large enough to have safe distancing, and also VFW halls around the state. And we also had collaboration within this leadership of maybe 100 people on Zoom calls to help amend Supreme Court rules to ease the ability to work together. There have been over 20 statewide hearings like this. Now in April, we have put together a statewide juvenile court leadership with Administrative Office, Children and Family Services Division of our court, and the Department of DCFS to discuss whether or not the juvenile court issues are being included in all the properly Zoom calls. And to hear some of the things that are happening around the states, it's exciting. Biological parents who never really had an opportunity to meet their children through visitation, because it was too far to travel, it was difficult to leave work if they had work. So through Zoom, and the courts giving the opportunities for Zoom, biological parents are meeting with each other. There's also hearings for temporary custody and hearings that the parents and even fathers who never participated, I'm hearing, are participating in these Zoom calls concerning their children. So some things are happening that have caused the court system to really move forward. Now, when the pandemic began, the Judicial College also started having virtual learning opportunities, educational events related to the COVID and health and safety issues in our courts throughout the state. Over 8,000 stakeholders have participated in those hearings on a weekly basis. In June, we approved the creation of the Illinois Judicial Conference Operation COVID Task Force that will continue through COVID. The 3 areas of initial focus include logistics of maintaining the safety for the court personnel and the litigants, juries, and the public, and use of remote proceedings, possibly with criminal cases are consistent with due process, and remote jury selection, which have been taking place throughout the state. And this is just a sample of the ongoing efforts of the judicial branch to make sure that the court system remains open and functioning during the pandemic. Of course, this is all a work in progress. Every day, everybody gets new calls. Something else has to be tweaked. But Going forward, we can build these collaborative efforts and hope to eliminate racial and economic disparities and improve access for justice. And I look forward to hearing from my panel members and answering questions with them. Thank you.
And thank you, Justice Burke. Next up is going to be Cook County Board President Toni Preckwinkle. Many of us first got to know her as a Chicago alderman, but this former history teacher has focused on criminal justice and equity in every facet of her public life. Those of us who've been following her for years have heard these refrains a lot, and I'm sure we will hear and learn from them again. President Preckwinkle, thank you.
Thank you very much, Craig. And I want to commend and congratulate all of our panelists. It's great to be part of this event. I want to thank Esther and Paula for inviting me here today to talk about issues that are challenging all of us in elective office. I want to talk today about reducing our jail population, electronic monitoring, and public safety. These are the issues that I've made a priority for my administration, and as Craig shared with you, these are issues that I focused on when I was in the City Council as well. I know these are issues that are important to all of you who are with us in this Zoom call. I want to begin my discussion by talking about Justice Burke. She didn't do herself enough credit. You know, when I first came into this job, we had a Justice Advisory Council that was sort of the vehicle for working on criminal justice reform issues, and it was pretty moribund. And I went to Justice Burke and asked her if she would be willing to chair it and help us initiate our criminal justice reform in my administration. And she was gracious enough to do that, and she did it for 8 years, and I can't thank her enough for her leadership. She's been a champion of criminal justice reform in Cook County, not just in the state of Illinois, but particularly here in Cook County, our home. And it would be really remiss on my part if I didn't acknowledge how important her role as a champion of criminal justice reform has been to the success of our efforts. So thank you very much, Justice Burke. Illinois law, says that money bond should be the last resort. And in Cook County, judges have begun following that imperative more accurately. And it's a result, frankly, of the work that was done under Justice Burke's leadership, Chief Justice Burke's leadership, when she was head of the Justice Advisory Council. Because one of the first things the Justice Advisory Council did was undertake a review of what was going on in bond court and what was really happening in terms of cash bonds. And where we are now is that, as I said, there's much less reliance on cash bond as a result of the initial work done by Chief Justice Burke and the Justice Advisory Council, and now all of our stakeholders working together to try to ensure that cash bond is the last resort instead of the default position in our courtrooms. The judges have gotten more training. We've designed an interview space so our public defenders could hear what their clients were actually saying. We've hired outreach workers to interview family members and follow up with employers and other sources of information. So we've made not only policy changes, but we've made physical changes in our courtroom. We've invested a lot of money in our bond courts to make them more friendly to the people who have to engage in business there. And I'm grateful to all of the parties, all of the public safety stakeholders, Chief Judge Evans, State's Attorney Kim Fox, Public Defender Amy Campanelli, Sheriff Dart, and Clerk of the Court Dorothy Brown for their collaboration in making these criminal justice reform initiatives possible. The Office of the Chief Judge invested in training and implemented a new risk assessment tool. We increased releases without putting the public at risk. And I think it's important to understand that until 2020, we were seeing simultaneously a reduction in the population in the Cook County Jail and a reduction in crime. 2020 has been an anomaly in many respects, which I'm sure we'll get to later. Over time, the jail population has declined considerably. In 2013, when we began in earnest our collaborative efforts, the jail population, the daily jail population averaged between 10 and 11,000 people. It's now down to about 4,900 people. And at the height of the pandemic, it was down to 4,000 due to the very concerted efforts, not just of the public safety stakeholders, but our partners in the criminal justice reform arena to get as many people out of the jail as we could safely, because the jails, as we know, are petri dishes for the epidemic. As I said, over time, the jail population has declined considerably from 10 or 11,000 down to 49,000 now. And that meant that fewer people who were too poor to afford to pay their cash bonds and those charged with nonviolent offenses have a better chance of being released either on their own recognizance or on electronic monitoring than they did in prior years. With the COVID-19 pandemic, as I said, we rapidly reduced the jail population down to almost 4,000 people. The good news is that we did this as a team, not only public safety stakeholders, but our partners in the advocacy arena. The state's attorney and the public defender directed their staff to work together to find people who could be safely released. And local partners paid bonds for county residents. The Cook County health staff at the jail did amazing work and turned the tide and got control of the COVID-19 transmissions in the jail. We're at the point now where new cases in the jail are coming from the community and not within the jail population. And we have the capacity as a result of the sheriff's good work and the work of our Bureau of Asset Management to quarantine and isolate those individuals that require either isolation or quarantine. Two factors have impacted our success so far with bond reform and jail population reduction. First is the expansion of electronic monitoring. Now, unfortunately, the electronic monitoring system hinders the ability of those released on it to maintain employment, education, or care for their families. Moreover, it doesn't reward success at being able to maintain compliance. And so we wind up with many individuals who are in electronic monitoring for very long periods. Another factor hindering our reforms is the false narrative that reforms are causing a spike in violence in Chicago. As I said, until 2020, what we saw simultaneously was a reduction in the number of people in jail and a reduction in the number of murders and shootings in Chicago. We know that the problem of violence in our city is systemic. This problem requires police to be a willing partner to improve public safety. And we need the police to make arrests as long as they're the right type of arrests. That is, people who are accused of actually shooting and not sweeps of nonviolent youth off the corner, bringing them into the jail. You know, arrests are not mentoring. False narratives are dangerous and we must remain steadfast. Over-policing is not the answer. I'm gonna say that again. Over-policing is not the answer, and neither is the overuse of electronic monitoring. So we're going to tackle electronic monitoring. My staff at the Justice Advisory Council has taken over finding housing for people who've been released on electronic monitoring, but do not have a place to live. It was called the no place to stay population, and they remained in the jail because we didn't have housing for them. We've increased our number of housing providers from 2 to 7. Additionally, the sheriff has declined to continue to administer the electronic monitoring program. This has given us an opportunity to reimagine what we want supervised pretrial to look like. My staff is working on reshaping electronic monitoring with the assistance of a technical assistance provider and other subject matter experts. In the near term, judges will still be ordering electronic monitoring. Orders to electronic monitoring should be regularly reviewed so that people who do not violate can be released from electronic monitoring. We have to increase movement to allow them to productively contribute to their families and communities while they are out and to be able to respond to success. We need to see the reduction in the jail population matched with a reduction in the population on electronic monitoring, as well as a reduction in the prison population. And we need to ensure that our reforms in the criminal justice system are sustainable, equitable, and lasting. Reducing the jail population, reducing those on electronic monitoring, increasing access to restorative justice, and more significant investments in critical services we know are needed. Employment services, healthcare, education, and trauma-informed counseling, to name a few. I want to thank you for this opportunity to be with you this morning.
Thank you, President Preckwinkle. Next is Jobi Cates. I keep mispronouncing your name. Next is Jobi Cates. She is the founder and executive director for Restore Justice. That's a statewide justice reform group that focuses on issues surrounding long-term incarceration. She's a past senior director of the Midwest Regional Office of Human Rights Watch. And thank you very much for being a part of this discussion.
Well, thank you as well, Craig, and thanks to our colleagues at the Illinois Justice Project, Sharone and Cabrini Green Legal Aid, for inviting me to participate. And I represent a lot of really wonderful people who are formerly incarcerated or currently incarcerated for more than 20 years for things they did before they were 25. That's our our group and their family members. So what I wanted to focus on a little bit today, it's a little different. I think we take a different approach because we are not, I don't represent a government entity in charge of administering these huge changes in our system now. But when I was asked to participate in this panel, I was asked to talk a little bit about the effect on individuals of COVID-19 and racial inequity in our criminal legal systems. So I'm going to start by going back to early March when our staff and board, which includes people who've served a lot of time in the Illinois Department of Corrections and their moms, we started getting very worried, and we were wondering how we were going to get information about what was actually going on inside prison. So we created a tracker that would help us to triangulate information from the data that is made available from the Illinois Department of Corrections. And I'm not here to talk badly about anyone, but the department has a very difficult haul trying to get information out publicly. So for whatever reason, that data is pretty sparse. We thought if we could document what was actually happening with loved ones and friends and relatives in prison, we could create a climate where we could help save some lives. The idea was that institutions behave better when they're being watched. Since then, we've documented more than 500 verified reports of what would in any signatory nation to the Rome Statute, my old Human Rights Watch background coming back, would be considered human rights abuses. In these cases, people who are committed to the state's care, to our care, we are the state, are being actively harmed, sometimes unintentionally just because of the history and the degradation of the system, and sometimes with some intent. But I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not here to announce a lawsuit, so I'm gonna stop using that kind of language. I am a mother, and I'm a sister, and I'm a wife. I'm a child of someone, of a dad. And while my 17-year-old son is not incarcerated, my closest colleagues for the past 10 years do have children, brothers, sisters, husbands in prison. And I'm here to tell you that the suffering of those individual human beings is unimaginable right now. Their suffering is really a window into the impact of an unjust system on the individual. So I'm just gonna tell a quick story, and this is a true story. This happened to a member of my team. I want you to imagine receiving a phone call from your son. I know many of you have children. And on this panel, he committed a terrible act at 15, but now he's 39 and he's in prison. He's been in prison since he was 15. He had his life sentence vacated in 2016 because of a US Supreme Court decision. And after a lifetime of believing he was going to die in prison, he had hope. He started making plans for his release in a few years. You get this call and you're so grateful for this and every call that you get from him because you didn't hear from him for 17 days in a row in the beginning of the pandemic. At that same time, you were hearing news reports from Stateville. Were there 5 deaths? Were there 12? There were no public reports of how many deaths there were at Stateville. How did you know? With communications shut down and erratic, you were left to be afraid and wondering. You've been hearing from him more now, but his calls are erratic because the facility where he is keeps changing their protocols and their procedures. You can't figure out when you need to get to the phone. When you do talk with him that day, he's depressed, and he talks about how he thought he'd escaped the prospect of dying in prison when the US Supreme Court vacated his sentence. But now he says they're gonna get him anyway. There may be a temptation for many of you to close your heart to this story. People in prison were involved in a crime. For the most part, not all. But as Chairman Preckwinkle said, some were involved in ways very tangentially, and some are innocent. But the impact on at least this one individual and this individual's mother is clear. But even if you don't care about either of them, you've written them off. They're probably part of the problem. Consider this. At the time COVID hit Illinois, we already had people serving dramatically different amounts of time for the same crimes. Why? Because of their race, their access to resource, and their age at the time of arrest, and because of the year that their crime occurred. We love to say in the society, if you did the crime, you should do the time. But the truth is, in Illinois, the time is completely, radically different based on arbitrary lines in the legal sand that were drawn by different groups of people in the General Assembly at different times over the past several decades. They make no sense. And they lead to sort of a nonsensical situation where you could have two men sitting in the same cell during a lockdown, during COVID-19, one of whom is serving 15 years for the same crime as the other who is serving 30, and will do every day of those sentences. What this practically means during COVID I know Craig, you mentioned that there are probably around 38,000 people in Illinois prisons right now. They haven't publicly updated these numbers recently, but there should be less because of all of the things that Chief Justice Burke and Chairman Preckwinkle mentioned. There should be less. It should be closer to 34,000 right now because of the transfer halt and other changes in the courts and slowdowns and the like. But even given that, there are perhaps 8,000 aging or elderly people who happen to be in prison today, regardless of their level of rehabilitation, regardless of whether they've aged out of criminal activity. And those people are living, those 8,000 people, they're living right at the intersection of racial inequality and pandemic because they're stuck. And it's not their fault that they're stuck in this time. There are many things that may be their fault, but this is not among them. So I'm going to kind of just talk a little bit more about another question we were asked coming into this panel, or I was asked coming into this panel, which is, what role should decarceration play in light of public health and public safety? And we've talked about gun violence and we've talked about the pandemic. And we've talked about slogans. I've heard earlier today, some of the slogans that protesters are chanting, free them and decarcerate and defund, the hashtags that you hear every day. I want to kind of say that we are not an activist organization at Restore Justice. We're a very practical organization, and we think decarceration, regardless of how you feel about the broader movement, is a smart public health and public safety strategy. So the simple answer to the question of what role decarceration should play in this larger public safety and public health movement is a big one. Dr. Ezike, our fabulous public health director in the state of Illinois, often reminds us that COVID-19 is a novel virus. There's much we don't know. But one thing that was hammered home in the 100+ press briefings that the governor and Dr. Ezike did with us every day during the pandemic, the beginning months of the pandemic, was that there are two major ways to combat COVID, particularly in aggregate settings. One is to create more space in those settings, as much as possible, make possible social distancing. And two is to dive deep into testing and contact tracing and health practices within these facilities. So decarceration is a way to create space for social distancing in facilities that are not built for social distancing. They're not built for airflow and for ventilation. They are not built for people to be able to control their own space, particularly in Illinois where prisons are old and crumbling. So decarceration was our first step, and Illinois officials, long-term policy ambitions around decarceration aside, did try to do some releases. They now, as of today, appear to have stopped communicating about intentional early release. They may be doing it, but they're not talking about it if they are, or releasing new data. From our perspective, these officials made a good effort, but they played it relatively safe politically, not taking full advantage of all of the legal mechanisms at their disposal. We know it's hard to look backward, and we know that, that this is not a straightforward task for any political leader. But the fact is that only 600 people were released using the earned discretionary sentencing credit mechanism to release people early. That's 1,600 people of the 30 some odd thousand who are incarcerated right now. Those releases varied wildly by facility. So in some facilities, much space was created, and in others, none. One of the facilities we've been most concerned about is Menard Correctional Center in Southern Illinois. It's one of the farthest away from the people who are watching. It has the most people who are serving super long sentences who are also aging. And it is a place where they have released, according to their last report, less than 10 people of the thousands that they have incarcerated there. While at other facilities, they've released hundreds and have created this room. It is incredibly, incredibly shocking to us as well with these early releases, that while 45% of the prison population is Black, compared with only 14% of the state, only 31% of those earned discretionary sentencing credit releases were Black. So how do you do that? How do you create a system where you're doing early release to save lives and you're releasing more white people in a system that's predominantly Black? I don't believe anyone intended a racially unjust outcome. I don't believe they sat down and said, let's release disproportionately white people from prison. I don't believe that at all. But the outcome stands. This is what happened. And it shows how people with good intentions and people who are running important offices representing a political point of view that is fundamentally about racial justice can still perpetuate racially unjust outcomes if they don't stop and take a more critical look at the decisions they're making in real time. And I'll pause there and just say thank you again for inviting us to participate. A lot more that we could talk about, and I'm excited to hear from Sharone and engage in some conversation.
And we will have more conversation even beyond that. One program note, thank you, Paula Wolf, for pointing this out to us. The director of the Illinois Department of Corrections is going to be on the panel after this one. So Jobi Cates, he will be addressing some of the issues that you raised. So we'll have that to look forward to too. But now, for last but not least, is Sharone Mitchell Jr. He's executive director of the Illinois Justice Project. He was a trial attorney with the Cook County Public Defender's Office. His current work focuses on pretrial issues, sentencing policies, and violence prevention. And he's also our host, or at least one of them. So thank you, Sharone.
Thank you so much, Craig. I think I would bicker a bit with you on the idea about last but not least. I think the only way you get on a panel with the president of the county and the chief justice of the Supreme Court and one of the foremost advocates in the state of Illinois, if not the nation, is if you knew a guy or knew a gal. And I think that's how I'm here talking with you all today. I don't want to be too long so we can get into our discussion. But you know, a common retort by someone like me who's sitting in my shoes is that we don't invest in the communities with concentrated levels of violence. And this lack of investment is said to be another example that we don't think that Black Lives Matter. But I want to kind of question that theory. You don't have to trust the guy in the suit jacket and tie and basketball shorts, but we know that our city and state combined spend billions of dollars every year on policing and incarceration. We heard that in the panel before, those numbers out there. And we know that much of that money is spent in the communities that we talk about, like the ones I'm from. So if you know Paula Wolf, you know this, she talks about this all the time. Before COVID, if you combine the number of people in the criminal justice system, those in the 92 adult jails around the state, the 16 juvenile detention centers, the more than 20 adult prisons, the 5 juvenile prisons, and all those in probation or mandarized supervised release, we'd have a population larger than any city in the state of Illinois, with the exception of Chicago. So we'd have Chicago, we'd have all those folks that are caught up in the system, and then we have, you know, Aurora, Naperville, and Joliet. That's before COVID. So we know that the footprint of the justice system is massive, and we know the investment is massive as well. But that investment is concentrated in policing, in courts, and incarceration. That is how we invest in Black lives in the state. So then the question we have to ask is, how effective is that investment? And I think COVID is starting to teach us that our footprint doesn't always have to be that large. We can reduce arrests, we can make our jails smaller, we can make our prisons smaller. You know, the prison population is down about 16% in the last 6 months. We can make those changes. Not enough. And certainly racial issues, as Jobi talked about, but not enough. With that said, listen, gun violence, that's an issue. We got to talk about that. I'm sitting in a community that's been affected by it. I've always lived in those communities. And we've seen a surge in the past month, but we've had declines in gun violence and declines in the population of the jail year after year after year. So I think there's little correlation between how much we incarcerate and how safe we are from gun violence. We see all over the country elevated levels in the last couple months. But I think that speaks to a broader concern that justice system is being presented to fix problems it can't even hope to fix. We live in a world where incarceration is our main violence prevention strategy. And every weekend and every morning, we read stories in the newspaper of the failure of that strategy. I was talking on the phone yesterday with a man in charge of operations of a large intervention program, which worked with young men to get them on the right track, get them to be peaceful adults. And we've had many conversations before, but I could hear the frustration in his voice because he knows the basic truths and I know the basic truths, and the system isn't responsive to them. We were talking about the people who are caught carrying a firearm, the type of offense that makes up a vast majority of gun offenses in Cook County. I'd love for people to check out a report by Loyola. Dave Olson just released it, talking about how we treat gun crimes in the county. And the person I was talking to was so exasperated because he knew and I knew that stays in jail and prison don't address the conflicts that drive violence. Stays in jails and prison don't create the opportunities that divert kids and young adults from a lifestyle that fuels this violence. And stays in jails and prison don't limit folks' access to guns or their perceived need to carry those guns when they come back home. So we have to have a conversation about the effectiveness of our investments and our use of incarceration to keep us safe. With that said, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the organizers out there who are calling for this new approach to public safety. I'd also be remiss, and we talked about before, I think there are no two people in government that have been more effective at pushing us to have a conversation about how we operate our pretrial system than the two women that are on this call. President Preckwinkle was talking about the racism implicit in the justice system before it was cool. She's been talking about it before it's cool. And Chief Justice Burke has been working on having us have conversations about how we approach this. She helped to put together a Supreme Court commission that is looking at pretrial policies and release an excellent report. But I also want us to talk about and mention how folks on the ground, how organizers and advocates have worked on this issue as well. The Coalition to End Money Bond, the Illinois Network for Pretrial Justice have been carrying the narrative, changing the narrative, and talking to us about how we can keep our community safe and how what we're doing now just isn't the right move. I'll end with this. I think COVID and the uprisings have presented us lots of opportunities, but really no more important than giving the justice system the time, the capacity, the energy, and the momentum to rethink the size of the footprint of our carceral state and ask ourselves how effective it can be in keeping us safe and how we can make these investments that are more aligned with the goals of safety and equity. So we can talk about specifics, but that's what I want to start with. Thank you so much, Craig, for leading this discussion.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you to all four of you. Now I want to try and open it up for us to talk among ourselves about things. And, you know, if we were just going to talk about COVID, we could go for the whole discussion. If we just wanted to talk about violence, it could be a whole discussion, but I'm going to try and get us to talk about both. But let's talk about the violence part of this. And what I think is something that we have to address is the issue of fear. Because we're getting it from the public. And Sharone, I think you are dead on about what does and what doesn't work. But I suspect there are people sitting in their homes thinking, yes, we're not going to solve the problem by putting all these people in jail, except that guy out there with a gun outside my house needs to be in jail, because then I can walk outside my door. And that's that kind of fear, the fear of judges who may not want to be the one who let out on bond or no bond or electronic monitoring the person who becomes the next headline. I mean, I think there are just, people don't want to be the one that gets a finger pointed at them. And how do we deal with that? And, you know, I'd like to hear from any of you who would like to, and especially Chief Justice Burke. I mean, I would think that there are times when there are people on the bench who just don't want to be that headline. And how do you deal with that?
I just want to say you're absolutely right. There are people on the bench who hesitate, I think, if you want to be honest, which I am, about making decisions. And they're supposed to be judges. We have an elected system, which I do agree with. I think people should not be disenfranchised about electing people, but we can also not re-elect them. And that's where education comes in. We need a better look at what's happening and who's making the decisions, how they've been making their decisions over their term of office and what they've done. I think Justice Preckwinkle has done that. She's been on many committees to interview people. Other people have done that. I think it should be a more public vetting of and knowledge of what the judges are doing. That being said, there is a statute. There's 32 points plus the pretrial service recommendations. And each detainee in front of a judge in bond court, for instance, may or may not have a background. That judge has to look at not only the current charge, but what the background of the person was and make decisions. And hopefully they're listening to both sides, as the Latin term in the Supreme Court says, audi alteram partem, to hear the other side, for every detainee that stands in front of a judge. And with the bond court reform, I must say that, thanks to Kim Fox, the state's attorney's office, they objected to every recommendation for bond by the public defender for decades. That was the custom and practice. Well, there is no custom and practice in justice. Every detainee deserves to be looked at by the judge individually and be heard. And that's happening with the public defender's office and lawyers and the judge now because of bond court reform. Statewide, you were talking about electronic monitoring. You know, Cook County and large population areas are really the only ones that are using any kind of electronic monitoring. If you look statewide, most places can't afford it, number one. If they are being used in more rural areas, it's mostly domestic violence situations. And the cost of electronic monitoring is huge. If even in Cook County, if we had the money that was used for electronic monitoring to help with housing for some of the people who actually can't go anyplace, they have no place to go when they're, you know, removed from jail or not sent to jail, they have no home, no place to be. If we had housing for them and services, and I would like to think of pretrial service people being mentors as opposed to probation officers, pretrial officers. I would like to have people there, more of them, to have iPhones, to text them. How are you doing? Don't forget you have court tomorrow. Have some personal contact with people. And that's the things we've talked about over the last 8 years or more. And that's what I would like to see in place of some of this electronic monitoring, some of that money used for personnel, you have your own person to talk to you. Come see me, talk to me.
All right, so let me just say, you know, I think what it takes is the courage of your convictions. If you believe in criminal justice reform, if you believe that our criminal justice system has disproportionately impacted people of color and poor people more broadly, then you have to stand up and say that. And you have to talk about the challenges in terms of racial justice. And that's what I've tried to do in my tenure as county board president, to keep the focus on the inequities in the criminal justice system and try to make the system fairer for everyone who comes in contact with it. We don't in the county have any choice about who's brought into the system. That's local police forces, local police departments. But we can do our best to see that people are treated fairly once they come into the system. And we had a system in which the poor were profoundly disadvantaged because of the reliance on cash bond. And we still have a system which is profoundly racist, like everything else in this country. You know, we live in a profoundly racist country, and nowhere is that racism more apparent, more laid bare than our criminal justice system. And we have to acknowledge that. And as one of the panelists suggested, we have to look at everything we're doing in terms of, you know, what's really contributing to racial justice. And, you know, when we have disparate outcomes based on race, we have to take a look at why those disparate outcomes are happening and what we can do to change them. So I guess what I'd say in Justice Burke has suggested that judges need the courage of their convictions and need to follow the law. And I'd say the same for elected officials. You have to have the courage of your convictions, and you can't allow false narratives. And the present false narrative is that somehow the criminal justice reform efforts are the cause of the violence and uptick in violence in Chicago this year. You can't let those narratives stand. You have to address them at every point, challenge them at every point, and lay out the facts for people, which is what we've been trying to do.
I would only add to that, and really thanking President Preckwinkle for that statement, is I think we get stuck a little bit in this sort of either or thinking, that we either have a criminal legal system or we have total freedom and anarchy where everybody gets to do whatever they want and there are no consequences. We also have a very short-term brain collectively, where we see people as they are when they're 17 and not as they might be when they're 40 or when they're 70. And I think those two factors have created, you know, you called it a false narrative, President Preckwinkle. I mean, it's nonsense. It's not based in any kind of human reality. We have many, many choices. For example, with sentencing, I know President Preckwinkle has personally been involved in some of the campaigns we've worked on with folks like Senate President Harmon and the former House Majority Leader Barbara Flynn Curry, to bring some sort of rational middle ground back to our sentencing practices. And the fact that it is almost impossible to pass a bill in a democratic state, fundamentally democratic state in the General Assembly, that would make it possible for a 15-year-old who's serving a very, very long sentence to get a parole review. The fact that it took 5 years to get those votes counted, for a 15-year-old to get a review on, say, a 70-year sentence, that we're still arguing about that when the rest of the country in many ways has moved on. And many other states and the federal government even have taken a look at some of these practices. But we have some very entrenched actors in this space who I think have really fed the false narrative, and like a fire, it's a flame right now.
I think there's a luxury and a privilege of being fearful without being concerned about being effective. And the fact of the matter is, our approach has not been effective. When I talk to the folks that run these organizations that are on the ground, that are looking to make our community safer, none of them say that just locking people up for a couple years changes the situation. They talk about people's access to guns. They talk about people's lack of access to jobs. They don't talk about locking somebody up, making us safer. We lock lots of folks up. Most of the folks that we lock up are people who are possessing guns when it comes to gun offenses, not who are shooting those guns. And we know that the vast majority of people who are accused of shooting those guns are incarcerated, whether it's effective or not, pre-trial. And we know whatever happens at bond court, folks still face consequences because they still have a case, no matter what happens, whether they get a cash bond or an I bond. If the evidence is there, they're held accountable. With that said, I think it's important to note that we have a system that President Preckwinkle has tried to stamp out that replaces risk in making those determinations with money. And that has meant that we have many more people who are incarcerated, not because they are across the state, people that are there because they're risky, not poor. So I think we need to end the use of cash bond all across and focus on things. If we're going to make incarceration decisions, which should be small, we should focus on risk. I think we also need to think about how our overuse of incarceration takes away from the actual issues that make communities safer. And I think that we do have movement on that issue. I think about the R3 program, which takes 25% of cannabis tax revenue, identifies objective communities that are objectively identified communities, and puts money for violence prevention and reentry services. We need to be doing things like that instead of just incarcerating people because we're scared of them.
Thank you very much. Can I get you to, any of you, to address the issue of the diversity of the court system, of the justice system, and how do we make sure that justice is being applied evenly, whether it's the southeast corner of Illinois or right here in the Chicago area?
This is Toni Preckwinkle. So I know that Justice Burke wants to respond to this as well. And I am grateful for the fact that we have an elected bench in the state of Illinois, because one of the things it's enabled us to do, and I speak now as chairman of the Cook County Democratic Party. I mean, one of the things that my predecessor, Jobi, and I were committed to having a diverse slate of people that we support for seats in the Circuit Court of Cook County, on the Appellate Court, and in the Supreme Court. That the diversity of our county be represented in the people that we put forward to be judges. Because I think it's really important that people with a variety of life experiences are on the bench. And the more people who are frankly black and brown on the bench, since most of the people who come into our court system are black and brown, I think the better off we're going to be. I think we're more likely to have people who are empathetic to the life experiences that people coming to our criminal justice system have, if they themselves are part of those communities. And again, I want to thank Justice Burke, who has appointed a lot of good people of color to the bench. I want to thank others on the Supreme Court likewise for doing that. And I want to acknowledge the work that the parties tried to do, particularly in the last decade, to ensure that more women, more African Americans, more members of the Latinx community, more Asian Americans get slated to run for judge, so that we have a diversity of life experiences represented in our judiciary.
Well, I affirm everything President Preckwinkle says. We do have an elected system, which I also believe is an important system. But let me just say this. The state is divided into 5 judicial districts. So by constitution, the state of Illinois is geographically diverse. Everybody on the court comes from someplace, except for 3 from Cook County because of population, from the corners of our state, which has been a wonderful thing for us. Lloyd Carmeyer, my predecessor as chief, he's still on the court, grew up as a farmer. Justice Thomas, who recently retired, he was a football player and a teacher. So, I mean, we have, and I was a gym teacher myself, a lot of diverse people on the Supreme Court. However, and thank goodness, Justice Freeman was a long-serving justice and African-American from Chicago, grew up in actually Virginia and moved to Chicago. 28 years he spent on the Supreme Court and worked tirelessly to make sure that people of color were appointed to the bench when there was an opportunity for the court to appoint somebody, and encouraged and mentored many young African-American men and women to be on the bench. And that's what we have to do. We have to make sure, affirmatively, mentor people, make sure, stand up for them, that they get elected and serve on the bench. Now, having said that, the next thing we do, if we don't have a wonderful diverse court, which we don't across the state, we have to make sure that people who are presently on the court are trained and have constant education on inclusion and diversity and implicit bias, which the court has just posted a position of a directorship for our court to make sure that our court will be diverse and lead the education piece of it for all our judges and court personnel. We're hiring a person for diversity and inclusion for our court, just to make sure and oversee all the branches and divisions of our court, that we are being very careful. Now that's one thing to do. That's a physical thing we're doing, but we all have to continue to work. One class is not enough. You have to continue talking about this. And that's what's wonderful about the pandemic in one way, is that so many people have been on Zoom and having conversations like this, and conversations they never would have had a chance to have before. They're convening with hundreds of people many times and discussing things that gives them permission also to talk. And I think that every voice should be heard, and we're trying very hard, and we need all the help we can get from everybody.
I do have one very quick idea, and it's going to be a very, very controversial idea, but I'm going to say it anyway. After spending time in prisons and in courtrooms over the past 10 to 12 years, it's the second part of my career, my life changed when I went to an Illinois prison as a friend, not as a VIP, as a friend. My life changed when I spent a day in a courtroom and watched what judges had to do all day long. I challenge any judge who's hearing a criminal case that results in any term of years in the Illinois Department of Corrections to go as a human, as a friend, to make a date with someone they have convicted 10, 20, 30 years ago, and sit across the table from that person and see who they are today. And I challenge every member of the General Assembly of the state of Illinois to do the same. And if they can't make it down to Menard or to Stateville or to Pontiac, perhaps they could spend a day at 26 in California sitting in one of those courtrooms and see the impact of the layering of laws and what judges deal with because of the layering of those laws over the years. And it's a challenge I don't lay down lightly, and it's not one I have not accepted myself. So maybe I'll start a hashtag later. I don't know what it'll be called. I need a cute name.
Thank you. Sharone?
Yeah, and I'll add one more thing. I think that determining who we have on the bench is incredibly important. Ensuring that they're diverse is incredibly important. Ensure they have a variety of life experience is important. But we also need to acknowledge, and I think Jobi was getting to this, is that we have systems built into the system that create all types of equity problems, all types of justice problems, no matter who is on the bench. So it's readily available to us, studies across the country, that Black people get higher bond amounts than white people, that Black families are hard up to put those bonds up because it's Black families that are paying them up. And that the incarceration due to not being able to pay those bonds lead to longer prison sentences. And you're more likely to plead guilty, not because you think you did it, but because of jury taxes or trial taxes. We know that there are all types of systematic things. We have 5 juvenile prisons with 120 kids in them, and we're spending millions and millions of dollars. When we know that that's not the best way to keep these kids safe and keep ourselves safe. We know, as we talk about police accountability, that there are issues in jails and prisons with law enforcement accountability. We know that we don't have the ability to document every single death of a detained person incarcerated, and that we should really think about passing things like the Death and Custody Reporting Act, so we know who's dying in our jails and prisons. So it's important to talk about who's on the bench. It's also important to talk about what judges have and what the system does in terms of resources.
I reluctantly want to turn away from this part of the discussion so that we can take some time to talk about COVID-19, because I get the impression that there aren't a whole lot of stakeholders who have bad intentions in this, but I get the feeling that there are people who are feeling like they're being caught between, equally unpleasant outcomes. Nobody wants inmates to die, whether it's in jails or prisons, But as Jobi so eloquently put, our institutions are not designed for anything close to social separation or health when we are faced with what we're faced with. So how do we solve those problems and still meet the demands of public safety, not letting people go who shouldn't be out, and not having the inequity that that Jobi was talking about, where more white people are being released than Black, even though the system is overwhelmingly Black. And,
yeah, let me just
President
say,
Preckwinkle?
you know, what I said earlier is, you know, we at the county are the recipients. People come into our criminal justice system, but they come at the behest of our local police department. So we do the best we can to ensure that there is fairness in the system when they come to us. But, you know, the fact of the matter is that Black and brown communities are over-policed, are hyper-policed. Black and brown people get arrested for things that white people never get arrested for. And as Sharone has pointed out, once they get into the criminal justice system, there's a very disparate impact, and that white people get different consideration than Black and brown people, particularly Black people. So when I've talked about the importance of having a diverse bench, quite true. But to Sharone's point, the racism is so endemic in our country that even when we have a diverse bench, there are all kinds of other factors that make the system disproportionately impactful negatively on Black and brown communities. And you know what we have to focus on is trying to figure out how we're going to make investments in Black and brown communities that reduce the number of people who are coming into our criminal justice system, given what we know about the terrible impacts the criminal justice system has on individuals and their families. And this afternoon, I'm going to be announcing that the county is going to be investing $5 million basically in violence interrupters, folks who are out in the communities trying to damp down the violence. $3 million is reallocated from our Justice Advisory Council programs on violence reduction, recidivism reduction, and restorative justice, and $2 million is money that we've kind of scraped up. But things are so difficult on the streets of Chicago that we felt it was imperative that the county support the efforts of the community-based organizations that are doing this critical work at this time. So we're going to be announcing that this afternoon. But I just have to, you know, we have to. It doesn't help us to invest in more police, frankly. We have to invest in more violence interrupters. We have to invest in the communities that are struggling with unaddressed trauma, you know, high unemployment, you know, food deserts, lack of access to healthcare. If you overlay on communities, you know, which communities are most impacted by COVID-19, which communities are most impacted by violence, they're the same communities, they're the same places. You know, the COVID-19 pandemic, 3 times as many Latinx and Black folks have been impacted by the disease in proportion, right? The proportions are 3 times as much in Black and brown neighborhoods as they are in white communities. And so the COVID-19 pandemic, as I said earlier, has basically laid bare, stripped bare the inequities that were already there and compounded those inequities in profound and terrible ways.
I would just like to say, Craig, on following up on Justice Preckwinkle's point here, is that there is one of the co-conveners is an organization called the Alumni Association, and it's a group of former incarcerated individuals. Those individuals call themselves former consumers of the criminal justice system. And President Preckwinkle absolutely, 8 years ago plus, when this organization began, had them come to the table of our Justice Advisory Council and advise us on what we needed to do with those people coming out of the jail. They are mentors to people coming out of the jail. They also try to get jobs for people coming out of the jail. So jobs is an important piece here. We need to work with our business people, our community, to make sure people who are coming out of jail, coming out of Department of Corrections, have a place to live and a place to work, so they can become contributing members of our society. We know through the Alumni Association, they're actually working in bomb court with the families there. They have other jobs that the Justice Advisory Council has given them contracts for, and getting other people jobs. So that's an important piece of this, so they can have hope and be proud of themselves and be contributing members of our society. And that does work. And those people should be at the table of whatever decision making we do, other than my decision of court. But outside of that, I don't want to see them in court again.
I'll add one more thing to it. You know, we assume a level of efficiency in the justice system that is not deserved. We assume that every person who's in jail and every person who's in prison are there because somebody who knows everything about the situation knows that they're dangerous, and the day they set foot out of that jail or prison, they'll wreak mayhem. And I don't see any evidence for that. I think Jobi's point was important. There aren't people who are making decisions about who's incarcerated that are sitting down with people a year, 2 years, 5 years down the line and taking an accurate account of who that person is now. So while I know it's politically expedient to keep as many people in jail and prisons as possible, and we have leaders like the ones on this call that are fighting against that urge, the fact of the matter is we can be doing much more with individuals in terms of getting them out, and we can be doing much more with the resources that we use to keep those folks in so that we can actually change the environment and make communities like the one I'm sitting in right now safer.
And Jobi, I want you in on this too, but I want to add a spin to it. I want to ask innocently, but isn't that what parole boards are supposed to do? And I know I'm being facetious, but I'm asking.
No, I'm happy to talk with you about that. That's a great point. We don't actually have a parole system for everyone in Illinois. We have something we call parole in the press, and that politicians call parole, and it's actually something called mandatory supervised release, and it happens after a person has already served their full sentence. They've done their time, and then we watch them for a period of time after, and we put them back in prison for that extra bit of years if we determine they've violated. We got rid of parole and what we called indeterminate sentencing. We got rid of this idea of a movable sentence in the late 70s in Illinois, unlike many states. And then we did something even worse. Then we took away earned discretionary time through a law called Truth in Sentencing that was passed, I think, the first time in '95 and went into effect in 1998. People who were sentenced for the same crimes after the removal of parole and the removal of good time, those people are stuck. They have no way out. They have no way to prove they've rehabilitated. They have no way to earn their early release if they've served serious crimes. There are exceptions on the lower ends of the scale. I want to make a quick point though, about violence and COVID. Why is anyone surprised that there is more violence during COVID? Why is that news? All of us are struggling. We're all dealing with exceptional levels of anxiety, unprecedented levels of anxiety. We're dealing with massive unemployment in our state. We're dealing with fear and loved ones who are sick. We're dealing with a doubling of the number of opioid deaths. Why are we saying, gosh, golly, gee whiz, those gangbangers sure are evil. Let's do something about it. Of course we're having violence right now. Let's not kid ourselves that we're just repeating the same summer violence. This is an unprecedented time, and it calls for unprecedented solutions. And I love Toni Preckwinkle, President Preckwinkle. I am so grateful that you're investing in interrupters. We know they work. Let's have more of them. But I do want to say one more thing, and then I promise I'll be quiet. I spend regular time, significant regular time with men who shot guns and killed people in the early and mid 1990s. I sit across the table with them. I bring my children to play cards with them. They call and talk to my husband or my son and ask about how my son's jazz concert was last weekend. These men are part of my life. And they aren't the ones who didn't shoot the gun. They're the ones who did. And they are the least violent human beings I know because they have dealt with what they did. They were our original super predators. They were kids who were on the street in the 90s and they were part of this gang culture and this life. But today they're kind of 40-year-old nerds who've spent a lot of time reading books and trying to figure out how to deal with the fact that they committed these terrible crimes. They are not violent human beings. They're people who did a violent act. And I really rebel against this notion that we have violence happening today, of course. We have gangs today, of course. Why are we still saying the shooter is in a different category? You know how these situations work. We all know how these situations work when you get a bunch of kids together. Who knows who the instigator was? We need to start looking at these situations as the complex, nuanced, difficult, traumatic, horrible things they are, and not as an excuse to play cops and robbers. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jobi. Is anything right being done with regards to dealing with COVID behind bars right now? Or are we still very deep into just very problematic dealings?
I think it's very oh, go ahead, President.
Well, let me just, we had some real challenges at Cook County Jail, which was a hot spot for a long time. I won't say a long time, for several weeks. And I want to just commend the Cook County Department of Public Health and the folks at CIRMAC, which is the public health facility in the jail, and the sheriff. And I want to thank profusely all of the advocates who raised money to get people out of the jail. Because we got the jail population down to 4,000, and we were able to single cell people. And in a congregate facility, when you have two people to a cell, needless to say, you're not physically distancing. It's hard enough in a jail to try to do physical distancing, but when you have two people in a cell, it's impossible. So we've made a lot of progress. Let me just say, I mean, one of the challenges we have in the jail now is that the Illinois Department of Corrections is refusing to accept people who have been sentenced for a crime and are sentenced to prison out of local jails, not just in Cook County, but all across the state. And so our jail population, although it got down to 4,000, is now closer to 4,900, in part because we have about 400, maybe it's more now, 400 people who should be in the Illinois Departments of Corrections and are in our local jails because the Department of Corrections won't accept them. Even though we've gotten to a point now where the COVID-19 virus in the jail is coming in through new detainees who are quarantined and isolated appropriately, rather than being generated within the jail population itself. So because we're testing people as they come in the jail, if they have COVID-19, we put them in quarantine or isolation. But we have some real challenges statewide. If the state's not going to accept people who should be in the Department of Corrections and we keep them in our local jails, we cannot do what we were doing when we had a jail population of 4,000, which was single celling people.
Now, I would actually say that one of the things I think that Governor Pritzker and the Illinois Department of Corrections did right from day one was to shut down transfers. I know this is in direct opposition to what the president just said. I think here's where the nuance comes in again, and nobody likes nuance and complexity. It doesn't make a good hashtag. But if we're going to start transfers into IDOC, we have to be able to prove that we can prevent outbreaks in IDOC. And we can't do that yet because we're only testing and have only tested 2.5% of the prison population. Of all of the states we researched, Illinois is 31st in number of tests conducted on people who are incarcerated. It's absolutely unimaginable why we have ubiquitous testing in Illinois, widely available testing in Illinois, why we are not using this potent tool. If we're not using testing in prisons and we're not doing contact tracing at a meaningful level, and we have not been able to prove that we can operate a facility without a risk of a major outbreak, I'm not saying we shouldn't do transfers again. I'm saying maybe there's a way that we can use one problem to leverage a solution on the other. The demand can't be open the prisons back up so that the problem moves from here to here. The solution has to be, we need you to open those prisons back up, show us your testing protocols so that we can figure out how to make this work together.
Okay, I'll say amen. How's that?
Excellent. Sharone?
Yeah, I'll add one thing. This is going to be kind of a wishy-washy answer, but taking from something we heard from the other panel, from Brendan Schiller and Attorney General Kwame Raoul. You know, COVID has meant that we have been held captive. And we've been forced to watch young people, and not just young people, but young people and middle-aged people and old people who have a lack of tolerance and acceptance for the status quo. And they are calling out every single day and saying business as usual ain't good enough anymore. That the things that we just accept, the systems and the programs and the things we do every single day that I saw every single day as a public defender, just isn't gonna be tolerated anymore. So I think there's a lot of pressure and wind at our sails to make things different. And when folks come back to the legislator, the state legislator, I think that they're on the clock and making some real changes. And quite frankly, there are lots of leaders in Springfield, Senator Robert Peters, Senator L.G. Sims, Representative Justin Slaughter, have been trying to get justice reforms done and have moved forward a good bit. But now they have the opportunity to really, really, really move forward as folks are really starting to see the things that we need to do. So things like ending cash bond, things like reducing our juvenile prisons, the things like making sure we know who's dying in the prison facilities and jail facilities. There are things that need to be done that we have the opportunity done now. And I want to thank President Preckwinkle, quite frankly, for, again, talking about those things before it was cool to talk about.
And before I ask the last question, and we only have a few minutes left, but I do want to play the cynical journalist and especially remind you, Sharone, we were talking about the wind at the backs of criminal justice reformers years ago, when it seemed like people on both sides of the aisle were all behind it, and we're still here. So yeah, I mean, you know, yes, these things are gaining support, but they don't seem to go as far as I think a lot of people had hoped. But yeah, I mean, am I not right?
No, I think there is no guarantee that these things will change. The system is built to be slow. There is still political expediency in being conservative. So there's no doubt. I'm not saying go out to Vegas and put it all on, we're going to reform the criminal justice system in November and January and everything will be perfect. But what I am saying is that we've never had a situation where people are out in the streets every single day. We are not on the heels of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor anymore, right? But people are still in the streets every day asking for these things. And I do think we are moving to a point where there will be electoral consequences for folks not doing the things that need to be done and following the leadership of leaders who are talking about this before it was cool to talk about it.
Thank you. Let me ask one other question. I'm sort of going to go pie in the sky here because we only have a few minutes left. But let's say you have all power and can change one thing in this system on any of the things that we've talked about, to just order one change. Now, admittedly, Justice Burke is probably the one person who could actually wave a magic wand and do this. But in all seriousness, I want to get each of you to say, okay, if I could make one thing different tomorrow, what would it be? And let me start with you, Justice Burke.
Well, first of all, I can't give opinions on anything, but if I did have that magic wand, I think this was discussed yet earlier today and today. We have such a hodgepodge of legislation, both criminal and civil, juvenile, that is all over the place. I would love to have our legislature look at it, not every part of it. And I'm sure that we would be able to have a lot of committees. They could have everybody wants to help make it right. I mean, if we're all really in this together, which we are, if we could just take this legislation, just look at juvenile justice, That's what Jobi was talking about. It's all over the place, and it's inequitable. And there's penalties that live with people their whole life. I mean, they've done their time, they served their time, they try to come back to the community, and it's unfair that they can't get a job someplace. And that's the kind of thing that those kinds of penalties don't live with them the rest of their life. That's what I would love to see. There's a lot of things I'd love to see, but right now I think clean up our statutes and the legislation to be equitable and fair for everybody. And that's what I would do.
Well, I guess I want to second what Justice Burke said about rationalizing our criminal justice system. I'd speak for the elimination of cash bonds. At one point, through the good offices of the MacArthur Foundation and Chicago Community Trust, the public safety stakeholders went to Washington, D.C. and looked at the courtrooms there. And basically, they have a system where either you're released pre-trial or you're in jail, and it's not on the basis of your ability to pay a cash bond, it's on the basis of your risk to the community. And we spent a couple hours in a bond hearing courtroom, and I think one person was held in jail, and that was a person who was accused of shooting at a police officer in a crowd, and everyone else was released. Some of them were released with conditions, a few were released, very few were released with electronic monitoring. A lot of them were released with pretrial services requirements, but I think cash bond is inherently unfair to poor people, and disproportionately the people who come in our criminal justice system are poor Black and brown people, and we should eliminate cash bonds.
Okay. Oops. Thank you very, very much. Okay, Jobi, you're up.
Ooh, I agree with everything that's been said. And Chief Justice Burke in particular, I would say, in addition to looking at all of the layers, that every positive reform we make needs to go back as well as forward. I don't think people understand the damage that's done when we make laws that improve sentencing and use modern data and new research and brain science to improve our system, and then we don't let people who've been convicted a year ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 40 years ago or 50 years ago benefit from those changes. It's created this caste of people in our prisons who have no hope. And I'm going to sneak in one more thing. I would give 2 weeks of time back to the officials at the Illinois Department of Corrections and in Governor Pritzker's office. I give them 2 weeks of time back to relook at their early release program and save some more lives.
Thank you, Jobi. And Sharone, you get to take us out.
Thank you. Craig, quite frankly, I love you and respect you up until you ask me this question. Because I think there are going to be a whole bunch of people that are pretty teed off that their priority didn't get in. There's so many things. There's no lack of things we need to fix in our criminal justice system. But I think it's always a good strategy to follow President Preckwinkle. And I'll say we need to reformat our pretrial justice system. Given my experience as a public defender, given my experience as just somebody who grew up on the south side of Chicago that has seen the justice system as both a lawyer and as a person who has seen folks go through it around me. Pretrial incarceration is truly the doorstep to both mass incarceration and wrongful convictions. You can't turn on Netflix without getting hit in the face with a show about some poor person who pled guilty to something they didn't do. Lots of that has to do with how we treat them when they come into the system. So ending cash bond is one way of doing it, but also reformatting the entire pretrial justice system. The Coalition to End Money Bond, the Illinois Network of Pretrial Justice has worked on a strategy. The Supreme Court has a paper out there that reviews the pretrial practices. I would say that we do the things that we need to do in the pretrial space to ensure not only that we are treating people fairly, but this is the important thing. I'm a guy who's living in these communities. To free up resources, to have real treatment of root causes. our communities aren't not safe because we don't lock up enough people. It's because we don't do the things that we need to do before the conflict happens to stop them. So whether that is talking about violence interrupters, you know, my top advisor, the person I respect the most in the world, my mother is texting me right now, talking about early prevention, right? Talking about what we're doing with kids, right? I think she's right, not just because she's my mom, but we spend so much money on inefficient approaches to the justice system. And that puts us in a space where our communities are facing much too much violence. So let's make our system a little bit more just. Let's make our system a little bit smaller, and let's use those resources by reforming the criminal justice system, pre-trial justice system, to treat some of these things that are harming us. Thank you so much, Greg.
Thank you. And I just want to say this has been a complete honor for me to be able to have this discussion with the four of you. It is, I mean, it has been eye-opening. I'm going to make sure that a lot of these words get heard by a lot of people, because this has been really a heartfelt and just a very positive and useful discussion. So thank you all for doing this. And that brings our panel to an end. And what can I say? This has been great. Thanks.